Hi, I'm Dr. Janice Morrow. Thanks for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things related to mental health. Welcome.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today again for another episode of American Mood Swings. I'm Dr. Janice Morrow, and today we're going to be talking about anger and rage and anger management techniques. And I've got a wonderful guest, Dr. Christian Conte, who has been working with anger management for over 30 years now. He works in maximum security prisons. He had started a clinic in, I think, Nevada. What I learned from your book is that yeah, that people being released from prisons are mandated to do a year of anger management, and so you started. But let's hear a little bit about your background, and then we'll just jump right in. And his book is called Walking Through Anger.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I've been doing this a long time. It doesn't feel like that long, but then when I think about it, this is actually 26 years of me doing this work. So it's a long time. I specialize in working with people convicted of violent crimes. So I deal with a lot of heavy stuff. But I also work with some of the best athletes in the world. I do sports psychology and I work with everyday people. So wherever I am, like I really have this tagline that the world boils down to two kinds of people, and that's it. There are people who have issues, and then dead people. So if you're alive, you have issues. We all do. So
Well,
I lead. I mean, I love the work I do because it's this is the work for all of us. I mean, it's all we are the only people in the history of humanity. Like think about this: you're the only person in the history of humanity who has unrestricted, unfiltered access to your mind. You're the only one. So I try to help people make their. I always say, if your mind is a place of peace, wonderful. But if it's a place of chaos, then it's worth you putting in the effort to work to try to find some peace.
well, I think your book is full of good tools. So let's talk about one of the things that you bring up is there's something called the cartoon world versus the real world.
So the cartoon world is this world that is a world of shoulds. So in other words, it is our world when we think people should think, feel, believe, and behave the way we think they should. And then there's the real world, how people actually think, feel, believe, and behave. And as long as you would align your expectations with your cartoon world, when I leave my house, my neighbor should wave to me, the traffic should get out of my way, the boss should give me all the credit for my work. And then you hit the real world, you pull out of your driveway, neighbor flips you off, people are cutting you off in traffic, boss gives credit to someone else. Then you're really upset. But the reality is that the world didn't upset you. The world just was what it was. What upset you was your expectations. So I spent the better part of 2.5 decades teaching people how to align their expectations with reality. And honestly, if I could reach in listeners' hearts and hand them one thing that we talk about today, it would be this concept. I have found that the cartoon world concept is the most powerful. It's simple. And so our ego likes to hear something and go, I know it. Okay, I already know that. But there's a big difference between knowing something and actually doing something. And it's not enough just to know that our cartoon world of shoulds is not helping us. We have to actually eliminate it or work to minimize it or at least become aware of it and then start to live in the real world.
All right. And I think everyone out there listening, I don't know anybody who hasn't had these cartoon thoughts.
I say, like, I have a cartoon world. I didn't come up with the idea of the shoulds. Karen Horney, a neo-Freudian, she wrote in Neurosis and Human Growth about the tyranny of the should. Albert Ellis used to say, don't should all over yourself. So I didn't come up with the concept of shoulds. I just frame it as a cartoon world because it is, to me, as fictional as a cartoon. And even though I've come up with this concept, I still have a cartoon world. It's not that it goes away magically. It's that you can be, and it'll help so much. We're going to talk about emotional management, anger management, but it helps so much because instead of saying, he shouldn't have cut me off, I say, I would have liked him not to cut me off, but he did. And now what do I do from this moment forward? And so it really helps us anchor ourselves in a reality that what life actually is.
Well, it's a little depressing, but I'll bring up what really compelled me to want to do this interview now. I've been wanting to discuss anger for a long time, but as far as like what should happen, I mean, there was a video a couple weeks ago. I'm sure everybody's seen it, of this very famous rapper beating up his girlfriend. Did you see that? Yeah,
I did, yes.
so, I mean, there's been rumors of this kind of thing, and there's been lawsuits and settlements, but until like we all think, and I was raised with three brothers, like women should not, nobody should get hit, men or women. But in the real world, like people are it is happening on our, I mean, that was extreme. I think everybody was really shocked, but I'd love to like moving on. So there's a people seeing your, one of the themes in your book that you mention a lot is like, or is that people see your actions versus your intentions.
Yeah, I mean that's enormous. And first of all, I mean for just even bringing that up, you're right. Like we can share the cartoon world, like we can go into that a lot because it can really help people. So, for example, yes, I was definitely raised. A man should never hit a woman. Like we don't want people hitting anybody, but a man should never hit a woman ever. But the reason why we can all buy into that and we can all believe it. But the fact is, if somebody is doing that, then the real world is it is happening. And the world I work in violence, a lot of times people say, well, they just shouldn't think that way, or they just shouldn't do that. But the reality is, it's happening all the time, and there's no the race, gender, socioeconomic status that gets away from it. Violence is everywhere, and so I would love to work toward minimizing the reality of violence. We have a very peaceful household in my household. But that's because I work with so much, I see so much abuse, so much pain. We knew that we wanted our daughter to be raised in an environment of peace that was based on learning and just learning from mistakes, since we all make them, rather than that idea of violence. But yeah, so what you just mentioned is a statement that can really impact your listeners' lives, like directly impact their lives. And that is this: people see your actions, not your intentions. So that means it doesn't matter in life what you meant to do or didn't mean to do. Oh, I didn't mean to say that, or I didn't mean to do. It only ever matters what you actually do. And when we step back and look at that, we judge other people on their actions, but we judge ourselves on our intentions. So if someone cuts us off in traffic, oh, that's a jerk. But if we cut somebody off in traffic and they get mad, oh, just chill out, I just made a little mistake. And so we have a tendency to minimize the harm we cause others, but amplify the harm they cause us.
Um, we've all done that. You just made me think of I was way many 30 years ago in junior college. I was doing security work and came home. I was sleepy because I'd worked the graveyard shift, and I cut some people off on the road, a car full of what looked like gangbangers. And they followed me for like a mile. I was shaking in my car. I was like 19, 20 years old and so scared. It was an honest mistake, but I was terrified because in their world, like I had just made it, but I was literally just sleep deprived. But it was a scary situation and accidental, but I did it. I cut them off, and they
But
were.
yeah, but it's an important lesson because in today's world, people are quicker to resort to violence, and so you have to be mindful in today's world not to simply be reactive for your own sense, for your own safety. So, in other words, maybe in the past you could flip somebody off and be like, but if you flip off the wrong person in today's world, that person could, track you down, and it's just awful. So I just really try to emphasize being mindful, both how we control our own emotional and how we handle other people's strong emotions too.
All right, well, let's talk about you. You mentioned that there's an emotional part of the brain, and then there's a higher part of the brain, higher thinking. And people in the medical world, we've heard of the frontal cortex and the cingulate, but everybody out there who's never heard of this, or the fight or flight response, because that's a theme that comes up from beginning to end in your book, that is the goal of this program you developed, yield theory, and we're going to get there shortly. But the whole goal is to get out of this emotional part of the brain and move towards the higher thinking, so we're less reactive. So if you want to go into that a little bit.
So, really simply, in the simplest terms, the middle part of our brains are our emotional center. So when we're emotional, that's the part of the brain that we would see neural activity the most in when we're emotional. When we're intellectual and you're just sitting there, we're doing what we're doing right now, having an intellectual conversation. The frontal cortex, the higher level thinking part of your brain, is going to be most activated. You'll see the most activity there. So what happens is this: when someone's angry and they start to express their anger, if you try to talk to them as though they should, cartoon world, be in the front part of their brain, they'll end up getting defensive and say, "You're not listening to me." So I developed an approach to say yield theory is about meeting people where they are and listening to what they're talking about. Just think about that. How many times have people started off a conversation with someone who's angry and said, "You need to calm down"? Like
Yeah.
that's never worked. Yeah, and that's never worked in the history of the world. Someone tells you you need to calm down, you get angrier. I need to calm down. You need to listen to why I'm angry. So when they approach us with that anger, to listen first, then to validate them. And to validate them doesn't mean you're condoning what they're saying. To validate is to acknowledge what they're talking about, acknowledge their what I call the side of the box. And then you can explore options from there. But until people feel heard, I call it draining the limbic system, because let's say your limbic system, your emotional center is filled up. Let's pretend it's filled up with water. And someone comes by and turns on a spigot, but turns it on and turns it off. Well, not much water is going to drain. It's still going to have a whole bunch of water in there. So, and that's my metaphor. I'm not saying there's water on the brain, but that's my metaphor for the limbic system. Let's say it has a whole bunch of energy and someone comes along and says one statement of, "Oh, you seem upset," and then goes right back to trying to fix it. Well, that's like not, so I say drain the limbic system, validate people, not until you think you validated them, but validate them until they actually feel validated. And you'll see an incredible difference. If someone actually feels validated, you can normally see that an exhale in the breath, or yes, you get it, like some sort of confirmation physically that they feel heard. So yeah, it's about listening, and then when someone's in a higher level part of their brain, they're able to make better decisions. And so it's one of the reasons why parents will tell me for years, "Well, I yelled at my kids 100 times, they still don't listen." And I'm like, "Because you're talking to the wrong part of the brain. You're screaming at them. They're in their emotional center. They're not taking that in." And so if you calmly approach them, teach them what they did that was ineffective, and help them learn, have them repeat it and teach it back to you, then they'll get it. But unfortunately, we impulsively and reactively just try to scream our way out of situations. And I just don't see that as effective a lot of times.
Well, you have a lot of great tools, so we're going to get to those. And unfortunately, it would just be great to be taught these tools from a very early age on, because these anger situations often they just happen so quickly,
Mhm.
like being cut off if somebody says something and you just, it's not always this slow moving and you just get caught up. And I think we've all been caught up in a moment. We've all said something or done something that we're like, almost immediately, I can't believe I
Of
said that.
course. Of course. And you are right. I mean, the way I look at it is I look at it as mental training. And so in the same way that people can be physically weak when we're young and get in an exercise program and become more physically strong, the same thing happens when we're young. It's not we're still learning and growing. So we have that mental weakness, but we can learn mental strength, and we can learn it at any age. But it does take effort. It does take self-discipline, and unfortunately, it's much easier to be mentally weak and not take time to make an effort to challenge ourselves. And so it's easier just to blame it on everybody else. Well, I wouldn't act this way if the world wasn't full of stupid people. And like, it's easier if you could get everybody to live in your cartoon world and think, feel, believe, and behave the way you want, then sure, you'd be perfectly fine. But that's just not reality.
Let's talk about, you mentioned something in walking through anger, the puppet technique, and how really what happens when somebody gets us mad. I mean, they've kind of like hijacked our brain. They're controlling us, and we've given our power to them. And you have an analogy, um, it's been a while since I saw Iron Man, but and I didn't remember it, but like there are ways we don't have to give up our power. But that's how you state that that's like essentially what's happening when someone, we could be having a wonderful day and somebody says something and we let them take over and like ruin our day or our vacation, or we go into
And
that.
it's fascinating that we do. But if I said to this water bottle, if I said to this water bottle, "Hey, water bottle, you're stupid. I don't like you," and it got all upset. It was like, "Oh, that's not nice." I'm like, "I'm just playing. You're the best water bottle ever." And he's like, "Oh, that's great. I'm happy." Then I'm in control of that water bottle, right? It's obvious, and sometimes adults will say, "I know that this guy's not giving me a puppet technique." But think about this. How many times, and I want every listener, everybody out there that hears this, how many times have you had your day going one way and then someone came along and did something or said something and it changed the direction of your day? Because in that moment, you became that person's puppet. They literally controlled you like a puppet. And you mentioned Iron Man, and so Iron Man, there's a superhero, and if I take a coaster here, but he had a power source in the middle of his chest, and so this literally powered his whole suit. And what I would say is he wouldn't, fight his opponent and take off his power source and say, "Here you go, opponent, you can have this." He would hold on to his power no matter what. And in the same way that Iron Man had a physical source for his power, well, we all have power as well. Unfortunately, it's not physical. We can't see it, but we do have a power about all of us. All of us, we have a power. And so, what I always teach people is imagine that your power was tangible. Would you take your power off and give it to somebody, especially somebody who just said or did something mean to you or not thoughtful or unkind? Why would we take off? Why would we give? And here's the thing, we literally give people our minds and become puppets to people we don't even like or respect, people who say and do awful, unkind, mean things. And we allow them to determine the course of our mind, and we just roll them along with it like a puppet. And so, I spend a career trying to help people take back power of their own mind, take back power of themselves, because we just give it away too easily.
I know I have.
We all have. We all have done it. We have all done it, and that's one of the reasons why I appreciated your kindness about my approach and seeing some of the videos and stuff, because I do lead by example. I do all of this first and foremost, and I challenge myself to live this. And I work in prison, so like if you don't live your message, you would be spotted and called out in about 10 seconds. So the one thing, if you walk into a prison, you better live the message. And so I've been blessed to live this message for a very long time. And I'm grateful to have come across this information. And I always say, like, I'm just happened to stumble on it sometimes before someone I meet. And so I like to, if they want it, then I'm happy to share it with them.
Okay. Well, I was going to move on to the next question, but on that note, there was one of my favorite stories from the book, Walking Through Anger. There was like somebody you mentioned, he was going to get out, he was being released from prison, and then something happened. He thought somebody stole $400 from him. And he was, he came to like the meeting or one of the classes you were doing, like, I'm going to get this guy. I can't believe he
Oh,
did
yeah.
that. And then with your tools and training, you basically helped him realize, like, is it worth going back to prison for? Like, what would you have given $400 to get out of prison? And then later, I mean, it's a great story, but well, the bigger theme is that in a moment, like where we have this beginning, middle, and end, and in a moment like of anger, we can do something that can just have this profound effect. And that story, I mean, it made me, I was so humbled because I had a similar experience. Well, I wasn't in prison, but I had a roommate years ago, and we just had a falling out. I had to keep some of her deposit, for some damages. It wasn't much, $300 or $400, but she was furious. And I wasn't there the day she moved out, but my iPod went missing back in the day when we had iPods, and they were kind of expensive. But yeah, and I wasn't filled with rage, but I was, oh, that's another point in your book, certainty. Well, we'll get there, but I was absolutely certain that she had stolen my iPod. She was the only one in the house with her friends moving. And it wasn't until like 2 years later when I was moving and I disassembled my desk, I was giving it away. And this iPod, where I kept it in the drawer, it had basically fallen behind the drawer, and it was there this whole time. never saw it, but I would have probably bet my life on it. And like this man, I think who you mentioned in the book, he later found his wallet, and he could have like ended up back in prison over $400
Yeah.
that he thought someone stole that never happened. And how certain.
Right. I mean, I really appreciate you sharing that story about that. That's a very powerful story to teach from. We really do believe. So Robert Burton, he wrote a couple of great books. One of them is called On Being Certain. And he demonstrates as a neuroscientist that when people are certain about something, it really, the part of your brain that's the emotional part of the brain tends to be more activity in that part of your brain during those moments of certainty. And what we think, what our ego convinces us, is that when we're certain, we're being intellectual, we're being rational, but we're not. Like if you just, it's just neuroscience. You look at the brain, it's the emotional part. And what that does is certainty is a downfall. It's certainly a cornerstone of anger. In other words, the more certain you are that something should have happened, divided by the fact that it did or didn't happen, is going to equal how angry you actually are. And so I teach a fundamental component of yield theory is non-attachment. And non-attachment, I see you have a Buddha in the background, saying hi to my Buddha in the background. Yeah, but I think that the Buddha taught non-attachment in a really beautiful way, in that we're not our things. So I'm not this sweatshirt. If I lose this sweatshirt, it doesn't make me less of who I am. If in the same way we're not our things, we're also not our ideas. If I learn a new idea and my old idea is no longer relevant, that doesn't make me less of a person. But the more attached we become to our things, the more attached we become to our ideas, the more we suffer when we encounter people who think differently, or when those ideas get challenged. So one of the great lessons from your experience, one of the great lessons from that story I tell, is that if you can just challenge your own certainty. So I will speak in front of thousands of people, and I will ask people, put your hand up if you believe, honestly, you still have more to learn in this life. And every hand will go up, every single hand. Everybody says, oh, I got more to learn in this life. So I always ask people, isn't it interesting that everyone in this room believes you have more to learn? So why is it that the moment someone disagrees with you is your first move to be defensive? Because if you really believe you have more to learn, then how do you know that person isn't about to help you see something you may have never seen before, or that they don't have a side of the box that you just haven't yet seen? And the reason why is our ego loves to convince us that we are 100% right about whatever we think, whatever we believe. I see people with diverse backgrounds from all over the world, different religious beliefs, and everybody, whatever their belief is, that is the definitive belief of the world, and anyone who thinks differently is wrong. And I can't tell you how many people I've sat with who've implored me, but if you have to believe what I believe, because my approach is absolutely right. I can't explain it. And that's people with widely diverse backgrounds, because that's what ego does. Ego convinces us that we're right. And it's the center of our anger. Because if you're really certain someone did something. So listen to this. I'm going to give your listeners what I call my fastest anger management technique. Fastest anger management technique in the world. It's the word maybe. So maybe he cut me off on purpose. Maybe he did it because he's a jerk. Maybe he did it because he doesn't like me. But maybe he did it because he's racing to the hospital to see his family. Maybe he just found out terrible news about losing a child. And the moment you infuse the word maybe, you quite literally take your brain from the emotional center where you're certain this is why he did it, and then maybe put your brain in the frontal cortex, the higher level thinking, because now you're trying to figure out other possibilities. So this is a neurological technique. It's science. It's just hard science. That the next time you're angry, infuse the word maybe. Maybe you're right about everything you're thinking. Maybe you are 100% right about your perspective, but maybe you're not. Maybe there's another side to this that you still have yet to learn about. And the more you can start to figure out those other maybes, the more you can calm down and rationally make a healthier decision rather than an impulsive, reactive decision.
Okay, that's great. Um, I want to talk about yield theory, your method and approach. There's 7 fundamental components, but I also wanted to go over the errors of communication. You mentioned in the book 5 errors of communication. So whichever one you want to start with, the errors or the fundamental theory.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so honored that you read and found all this information. I'm so grateful. Like I said, I'm used to doing 3-day seminars, 5-day seminars. So these are like topics that could be all day long, any one of them.
Exactly. They really are.
And
I'm sorry, whatever we get to, whatever we don't.
no, I'm excited. I'm excited. I'll give you yield theory in a nutshell. Yield theory in a nutshell is this. Essentially, I've spent a large portion of my career working with people who absolutely did not want to be there. And so I could have easily said, people who were sentenced to anger management groups, kids who had to see a counselor, officers who don't want to be trained by somebody who has a therapy background. Like there's so many, so I've encountered so much resistance. And what I've done is I've developed an approach that says I can still meet that resistance where they are, get around it, and then again talk to the part of the brain that wants to hear it. And so I've made a career out of meeting people where they are, getting around the fight or flight response, and speaking in ways that can be heard regardless of how intense the emotions are. And essentially that's what yield theory is. And I always say, when I was young and I would be pushed to read these really intellectual books, philosophy books, when I was a teenager. And I'll never forget the first time I read Hegel. It was so complex. I thought, when I grew up, I'll never make things this complicated for people. So I really worked hard my whole career to make things super simple for people. So ultimately, yield theory is this. I ask myself, what is it that I do? Like I stand at a cell door and I talk to somebody. I sit in a comfortable Zen setting and talk to some. Like, what do I do? And I realized I only do 3 things. That's it. I listen, I validate, and I explore options. That's the essence. Those are the 3 core actions of yield theory: listen, validate, explore options. And I like to tell this story because it's a true story. And it's really a funny story. But maybe about 10 years ago now, I was speaking at this mental health convention. There were about 500 people there. And a woman came up to me and she was super condescending at the break. And she just looks down on me and she's like, that's it? That's your big theory, 3 things? And I said, yes, ma'am. But if you think about it, all Bruce Lee ever did was move, block, and hit. He did pretty well for himself.
Yeah, you mentioned it.
And I said, essentially we can say it's just listen, validate, explore options, but it's how you listen, how you validate, and how you explore options. And it's interesting because I do a lot of trainings for officers, and sometimes we'll get people in who are younger psychologists, maybe they just got their degree, and they actually won't do as well as the officers will do. And part of the reason why is they want to talk about how they already know how to listen and they already know what validation is, whereas the officers will just be like, I'm just going to listen and actually validate. And so that's how ego can get in the way. So yield theory is doing those 3 things. It involves leading with humility and compassion. And so when I say humility, here's what I mean. Our ego believes, I already know that. I already know how to do that. I already do that, right? That's the kind of things our ego says. I already do that. I already know that. But to be humble is to say, I really do believe I have more to learn. So I'm asking you, teach me about what's going on with you. Like, I don't know what's going on with you. I don't care how many thousands of people I've seen. Every new interaction, even if I've met the person before, this interaction right now, I'm not going to claim to know everything that's going on in your mind. And I want to know, so teach me. And when you lead with humility, it is disarming. When you come up to somebody, you need to calm down, you need to listen to me. That arrogance is met with resistance. But when you come up with humility, like, what's going on? Teach me what's happening. Like, the more humble you are, and you're genuinely humble, you really want to know, the more disarming that is. So yield theory really does boil down to those 3 actions: listen, validate, explore options. Now, the reality is that if you're into counseling or psychology, I specialized in theories, teaching theories, and I love counseling theories. So it can go really deep, really fast. There are 7 fundamental components of yield theory that drive the way we listen, validate, explore options. And just, again, this is like a super quick nutshell type thing, but it's, acceptance. We want to accept where people are. We want to accept the real world, not the cartoon world. So acceptance is about meeting people where they are. That's what it means, acceptance, not accept whatever they're doing and it's okay. We don't condone wrong behavior at all. Like I don't condone violence in any way, shape, or form. But accepting means I'm going to accept where you are. Matter of fact, the easiest way for me to describe this is to tell this little story. So there was a man who was supposed to lead a group of people up a mountain. So he starts running full speed. He gets to the top of the mountain and he looks, and not a single person was with him. They were all literally at the bottom of the mountain. So he starts screaming at him, "You should be up here with me. You should have followed me. You should have came the way I came." And he had all the logic in the world, but the truth was they couldn't even hear him, let alone see him. So he becomes known as the fool on the mountain. All right, so we might think, well, this is an ancient tale, which, by the way, I made this tale up. I just make it sound like it's an ancient tale. But we, I love mythology and I love reading it, and I've created my own stories through the years. But the fool on the mountain is what I came up with because I'm trying to describe what happens when we think we're being really logical, like you should have done this and that. It doesn't matter. That's cartoon world. If we really want to lead those people, we have to have the self-discipline to leave where we are and go meet them where they are. So that's what acceptance is about, accepting the reality of where people are, what they're ready, willing, and able to change. And then the next component is called authenticity. Excuse me. So authenticity is genuineness. And I always tell people, like, you can spot a fake easily. You know, you'd be like, oh, I can spot a fake. But how aware are you that people can spot it when you're not being genuine? You know, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm fine. You know, oh, I convinced them I was fine. No, they didn't really buy that, but they might have been nice in the social context. So being authentic matters. And then just go over kind of quickly, compassion is huge. Compassion, again, doesn't mean you're condoning people. It does mean that you are putting yourself behind their eyes. So in yield theory, we always say, if I lived every day as another person, not just walked a mile in their shoes, but if I really had that person's intellect, their emotions, their life experiences, then how can I say I would have done anything differently from what they did? And that's what we mean by the essence of compassion. Then there's conscious education. We're not just listening to people. We're really adding some new insight. Like that may be technique. That's adding an insight to hopefully help people curtail that anger. And then there is creativity. Since there are so many people, people are different. They learn differently. So we can't teach everyone the same way. So creativity involves meeting them where they are and doing what works for them. Two more. Mindfulness is being mindful, be aware of what you're doing, cultivating mindfulness of how you come across to others, what you elicit in others, and what others bring out of you. And then finally, non-attachment. And I talked a little bit about that earlier, but non-attachment is probably the biggest component for actually practicing yield theory, is being able to practice non-attachment. That's why it takes usually practitioners a couple of years before they really can say they're practicing yield theory, because non-attachment means people can challenge you over anything. And you can really say, you know what, maybe you have a point. Like, I believe profoundly in what I believe in, but I'm open that I could be wrong. And if I learn something new, I'll adopt that, and I'll be grateful to get to have that experience. So that's yield theory in a nutshell.
Well, and for listeners, the book goes into it. His book, Walking Through Anger, goes into all of these in depth with lots of stories and a little deeper. We're just short on time today. So let's talk about, that's yield theory. And then let's talk about the 5 error. Well, real quickly, shame versus guilt, because that gave me goosebumps when I read the difference in your book, the difference, how you differentiate. And then let's go into the 5 errors, because that, to me, that was out of all the chapters in the book, like, because I felt like I was guilty of all of them. And it was like,
we're human. You're human. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
See, I think that's honesty and that's authenticity. Like, you're human and you're real. And of course, we're going to make those mistakes. So shame versus guilt is really, really important. Guilt is feeling bad about something that you've done. Guilt can be really healthy. If you feel bad about hurting someone else, good, learn from it and move on. Guilt is feeling bad about what you've done, but shame is feeling bad about who you are. And my research, my time specializing in violence, has taught me in a really profound way that shame is not healthy. Like, you think, well, I'm going to shame this person from doing something. But unfortunately, in the real world, when you shame people, let's say specifically, one of the things that still gets me angry and still gets me passionate is trying to help defend innocent children. Like, children to me are as innocent as can be. And when people perpetrate violence on children, to me, that's the worst possible crime you can do. What I've seen when you're treating or working with people who have hurt children, if you were to shame them, then maybe you might feel good in the moment. I shamed them. I told them what a piece of, you know what they are. Unfortunately, the reality is then a large portion of people who hurt children aren't going to take it out on you or confront you. They're going to bottle it up. And then when they can get around someone they can hurt, they're going to take it out on them. And so I always say, like, to me, the goal is to move past shame, shine a light on it, see that you are not your worst moment, and let's learn from it and let's do new behaviors from here forward. So the reality is, we are not our worst moment. None of us are our worst moment. And we have a tendency, even when we come to terms with ourselves not being our worst moment, to still judge other people by their worst moment. And so it's powerful. I mean, shame versus guilt, it's such a powerful thing. Guilt healthy. If you hurt somebody, that's fine. Learn from it. It's goodness. I always tell people, if you hurt somebody and you feel bad, sit with that for a minute. And if you don't like how it feels, you're probably not going to do it again. And that's a really good thing for the world, is for us to learn from our mistakes. But I don't think it's healthy to sit in shame at all.
People. Well, let's go into the 5 big errors of communication that we've all done. And I wish I had heard this material like 20 years ago. Actually, that is the question I had for later, but I know that you work a lot with adults. I personally would love to see these kinds of programs, or your program. Have you ever, has that ever entered your mind, like going into high schools or junior high? Has that ever come up, or have you ever been approached about bringing these techniques and tools to the schools?
I'd say since my very first groups I used to run, I would have guys tell me, I wish we could have learned this when we were kids. Um, I am the International Yield Theory Institute is something that's launching this year, and we will recruit people from all over the world, and there will be people who will go into schools and do that. And if you're interested, if listeners are interested, and they want to learn more about it, right now they go to drchristianconte.com, but the Yield Theory website will be up soon this year, where we can have people who want to go into schools and do this. This will be wonderful. We have curriculum that people can use that are, I think, really necessary for people to learn. So I love how you like the 5 errors. I essentially stepped back and said that the idea came from my dad. Actually, my dad said, if you were to just look at, are there mistakes people make when they communicate? Like, he was reading through my book, and he said, this was back when I wrote Advanced Techniques for Counseling and Psychotherapy. And he said, are there basic mistakes you see, common mistakes you say? So I sat on that for some time, and then it hit me that there are the 5 errors of communication. So they boil down to how we talk, how we listen, and what we take away from it. But here are the 5 errors. The first one is called the error of approach. And the error of approach occurs anytime we shut people down from the moment we interact. So think about this one. Your loved one comes up to you and says, "We need to talk." Like, the second that happens, the second that happens, you're like, "What? What do we need to talk about?" "Oh, we'll talk after work." "Oh, no, we will not talk after work." You know what I mean? So you shut somebody down from the very beginning part, and now they're in their emotional center, and your conversation is already off to not a healthy start. The next error that we make is the error of interpretation. In other words, I'll do it like a funny way to exaggerate if someone's just listening. But how you doing? Fine. Oh, okay, great. You're doing well. That's good. And so there's a difference between what people say and how they say it. And when the error of interpretation occurs, when we fail to accurately understand what people are saying. So that's the error of interpretation. Then we have the error of judgment. And the error of judgment is huge. This occurs anytime we judge people rather than assess them. And there's a big difference here. It's natural for human beings to judge someone, this you're wrong or bad. What I think is healthier to do is to assess someone. So I don't need to have a judgment for you, but I do need to assess what's going on. If you are someone who cannot keep a secret, okay, I don't need to judge you as someone who is this. I just need to assess you're not someone I'm going to share a secret with ever. Like once I see that, boom, that's it. I've learned that. And it's not a matter of me needing to dwell in judgment. It's a matter of me needing to assess where that person is, what their past behavior says about them, and what they're most likely to do in the future. So the error of judgment occurs when we judge people rather than assess them. Then we have the error of language. And the error of language is something we're all guilty of. And I just used it right there. All, everybody, nobody, always, never. So you could say to somebody, well, you never listen to me. And if they're like, no, remember that one time back in 1997 when I listened to what you had to say? And boom, you got it. So it's about a matter of being accurate with your language. This is another really great anger management technique. So we know extreme words produce extreme emotions. For example, if I really believe no one ever listens to me on a planet of over 8 billion people, if no one ever listens to you, then yeah, you got a problem. But if the more accurate reality is you tried to talk to a couple people that day and they not only didn't listen, but didn't actually take in exactly what you wanted them to hear, or in your cartoon world, that's a lot different. So I always teach people about using accurate language. I talked to 2 people today that didn't hear what I wanted them to hear. Okay, that's not as bad as no one ever listens to you. And you think about the teenage brain. The teenage brain is still growing, so it's primarily in that limbic system, that emotional center, and that's one of the reasons why teenagers will speak in extremes. It's one of the reasons why if they break up after 2 days, I'll never meet anybody again, because they're in that emotional center. So then finally there's what's called the error of omnipotence. And I borrowed this particular term from Kellen Mueller in the world of counseling on this particular term, because what happens with the error of omnipotence, it occurs when we take responsibility for what other people say and do. So I am 100% accountable for every single thing I say and do in this life. I am not accountable for what other people say and do in this life. I'm only accountable for me. My job is to give the world my best, and then I got to let go. And what happens is all too often, someone asks you for advice, and then they don't take your advice, and you get mad at them. Like, well, maybe they weren't ready to take your advice. Maybe your advice wasn't that good, and they didn't feel the assertiveness to tell you, because you crumble anytime someone tells you your advice isn't helpful. Maybe your advice was excellent, but they weren't in the stage of change ready to do it. In other words, once you tell them your advice, if you give it to them, if I'm doing a seminar, I might hand somebody a notebook and say, here, take this. And then when they go to take it from me, I hold on to it. And I say, take it, and they won't take it. And they're trying to pull on it, but I hold on to it. And that's what happens when we don't give advice and actually let go. So if someone comes to me and asks for advice, I might say, here's some advice, but do whatever you want with it. I'm not attached to whether you use it or don't use it or whatever. My job is to give you my best insight. After that, it's up to you. So the error of omnipotence occurs when we take responsibility for what other people say and do. So those are the 5 errors in a nutshell. I think you're doing a phenomenal job of getting through a tremendous amount of information.
I know.
And like
well, I'm just going to keep it encouraging people to read the book, and then you have a course on. I had never heard of Himalaya.com. And there's other courses, but there's like 3.5 hours of your material on there, and it wasn't very expensive, I think. But you just go into this. We're just touching on the surface here. Let's talk about you. There were some other, you mentioned extreme examples of extreme, always, you never do this, but you had some other language don'ts, and then you go into something like that we need to be mindful of our energetic presence, because things like what we're doing with our eyes, eye contact, eye rolling, pacing. That was all new information for me. Sitting versus standing. If you just kind of like want to touch, these are things that we can do that we might accidentally do to put someone in that fight or flight. And you have tools to help us, like mentioning these things. Can you just kind of talk about that a few moments?
Yes. So
I know.
I'm 6 feet, 260 some pounds. If you're just listening to this, I'm a
Scary.
big,
Scary looking.
scary looking guy, big bald headed guy with a beard and tattoos.
Yeah.
So my wife is significantly smaller than I am. So if we were in an argument and I was standing up, it doesn't matter if I don't mean, remember, people see your actions, not your intentions. It doesn't matter if I don't mean to be intimidating, that would be an intimidating position. So one of the things I always would tell men when you're in a disagreement, first thing to do is sit down.
Mhm.
And when you sit down, you're not trying to unconsciously, puff up, excuse me, to potentially dominate in some way. So here's the reality is you play a role in every interaction you have. And one of the very challenging things for people is this: we have a tendency to minimize the harm we cause others, but amplify the harm they cause us. So we have a tendency to downplay it. I might have raised my voice a little, right? Versus I screamed. And so when you say it, and when you're describing your own behavior, we often fail to recognize the presence that we have. And all I try to bring is shine a light on is some awareness around this. You do play a role. Sometimes people will say, I didn't do anything. I didn't say a word. Well, if you've ever been on the recipient end of someone who's using silent treatment, it doesn't feel very good. So even though you could technically tell a third party, I didn't even say a word, and act like you played no role in that interaction, you played a profound role in that interaction. And so you want to be mindful of your energy. You want to be mindful of, look, if two men sustained eye contact for 5 seconds, testosterone runs like 80% higher. So they start to and one of the biggest lessons from yield theory that I feel grateful to share with the world is that your mind always wants to match your body. So whereas something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is wonderful, I draw on it a lot. Cognitive behavioral therapy is wonderful. They'll say that your thoughts determine your emotions. I would say your thoughts are impacted by your emotions, or your thoughts impact your emotions, but your mind always wants to match your body. So if we down a bunch of energy drinks and we're really shaky and our body's mimicking anxiety, our brain will race to find a story that makes sense out of that anxiety. Oh, I forgot to call so-and-so. I forgot to send this email. I didn't pay this bill. And we'll try to create a narrative that makes sense out of our body. It's one of the reasons why people argue when they're hungry, they're hangry, they're agitated, and so they start to pick at their loved one, and then they eat, and then they're like, "What were we arguing about? I don't remember." So you want to be mindful of your presence, because you don't get to say, I didn't play a role, because you play a role in every interaction you have. Now, unfortunately, when people are struggling, when they're either very young or when they're struggling as an adult, they have a tendency to think in extremes. So it's either or. When you're children, that's all you can handle. Your brain doesn't understand the gray. But as adults, they can drift back into that either or thinking. So it's like, so you're saying, I caused everything, or I didn't cause anything. No, listen, it's not the extremes. You do play a role in every interaction. You don't cause people to do this or that, but you certainly impact them just the way they impact you. And so I think it's really worth being mindful of your presence, what you bring to interactions, what you leave behind. If you can't answer this, if I ask right now to listeners, what is it like after you leave a room? Do you uplift? Are people uplifted? Are they encouraged? Do they feel peaceful? Do they feel anxious? Like, how do people feel when you leave a room? And if you don't know that, guess what? You will always be the only person. This is profound. For the rest of your life, you will always be the only person who doesn't know how you come across to others, because every single person you encounter knows how you come across to them. So it's really worth becoming mindful. How do you make people feel? How do people feel around you? Do they have to listen to your cartoon world? Are they supposed to speak, look, act a certain way, or else whatever your should, consequences are? So be mindful of your presence. Be mindful of the impact you have on other people.
That's that I've never heard that. Like, how do you make people feel when you leave the room? You hope
Well,
people.
I was meditating about, I don't know, maybe it's 5 or 6 months ago now, where I right out of I like shot up out of this meditation when that thought came to me, and I realized if you don't know how you come across to others, you will always be the only person for the rest of your life who doesn't have that information in every room you go in. And that hit me, and I like jumped up and I wrote it down because I was like, holy crap, this is so true. You literally will be the only person in every room you go in who doesn't know the impact you're having. So it's worth understanding how you come across to others.
Well, on that note, you just mentioned it a little more. Like, you even mentioned in the book, vocal tone and your volume and the delivery. Like, um, my partner for the show, the creator of the show, American Mood Swings, he's been told he can get really intense, and he doesn't realize, so he's working on that, like the volume of his, when he's upset or something, the volume. And then he's kind of a big guy like you, and you don't realize how intimidating, if you're kind of leaning in or moving towards someone and you're getting louder, it's a scary feeling. Like, they don't know what
Sure.
you're gonna do. But
Sure.
be oblivious to like how you're coming across. So I guess there's two things I want to kind of end with, because meditation is a very powerful tool, and everything I've seen, the research, the last few, I used to meditate. I haven't in a long time, but it was very helpful. But I've seen a lot of research where when they've introduced meditation at the schools, I think 60 Minutes did a special a few years ago, when they've replaced like the traditional detention with meditation, teaching kids. And in prisons, teaching these people before they're out, like there's a lower recidivism.
Recidivism.
and the
Recidivism. Yeah.
and the kids, same thing, when they replace the traditional, like, go put your nose in the corner, and teach them these meditation techniques, how the truancy rates decline. It's like night and day. And you mentioned this a lot in your book. So let's, and then like the final thoughts, maybe again, just to, that we aren't, we're so much more than this terrible moment. And I'd like to just bring up like one example of that. I mean, we've all had a terrible moment, but a powerful one to me was a couple years ago, because I love Will Smith, the actor, a rapper, singer. And we all saw what happened at the Oscars. Someone he got mad. Someone said something, he thought, a comedian made a joke about his wife, and he walked on stage. But he has like this 30-year history of being a very nice man to his fans, a hard worker. And in that moment, and I still love him, but you can't forget what you saw. And then even like I mentioned it earlier, Puff Daddy hitting his girlfriend, like there's a lot of karma there, because there's like 30 years of people that have had stories. So I guess he's got to work out his karma. But I still felt sad, because I thought, watching that, like, because I have three brothers. My oldest one's had like anger. He's 64 now, and he's still struck. I pray that he'll find some peace. I wish I were in communication, have him read your book and take your class. Um, but that, I just felt sad. Like, I wonder if he was even self-aware enough where he ever reached out and Googled, like I did with you, anger management, or these tools that are out there now. We will, I'm sure, now that the whole world is aware. But
Sure.
anybody that had in this moment, like, we can be defined, and you can have this whole history, and we're not that. We are more than that. But I'd love for you to talk about that, but then also the whole meditation and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think meditation, to me, it's in 2024. I get to tell it. If this was 20 years ago, I could have just sounded like I was out there. In 2024, it's as simple as this. As sure as push-ups are a direct one-to-one correlation to getting stronger chest muscles. If you do push-ups, you get stronger. If you don't do them, you don't get as strong. In the same way, when you meditate, your brain operates in a healthier, more effective way. And you can't just have done it once or a while ago. It's not something. And a lot of times people say, well, I can't meditate, doc, because I can't turn my mind off. And what I say is this: meditation is not about turning off your mind. It's about observing it. And so I go over basic ways that people can meditate, sitting up, close your eyes, do your best not to move. If you can have a still body, it's wonderful. Um, Lots of research shows 5 minutes of meditation for 6 straight weeks makes physiological changes in your brain. And so you'd sit up, you'd find a place. If you could, the place would have silence, or if you had music that didn't have lyrics, that would be great. And then here's the thing: you don't have to have a quiet environment. I literally teach meditation in solitary confinement, which in the movies probably sounds like a quiet place, but in actual prisons is one of the loudest places in a prison. People, yeah, the way the systems are set up, people can see each other, and they gang war on the door a lot all day long and yell at each other and stuff. And so it's one of the loudest places. But what I teach is you can have self-control regardless. It's meditation's about controlling your inner world. So at the end of the day, although it would be nice to have an outward environment that was peaceful, you can do it anywhere. I have guys that do it, and men and women who are in solitary who do it and can get to a place of inner stillness regardless of what's going on around them. But it's extremely helpful. You'll increase your self-discipline, your effort. You'll increase your effort. I think it's something that I would strongly advocate for people to do. But if you're not ready to do it, you're not ready to do it. And if you try and it doesn't work right away, or you're looking for instant results, you're not going to see it that way. You will notice it. And for example, like if you chose not to scratch, like let's say you sit still for 5 minutes, set a buzzer on your phone, 5 minutes. Let's say that during that 5 minutes, your face itches. But instead of scratching it, you say, oh, my face itches. It's not the end of the world. I don't need to scratch it. I'm okay. I can handle it. Now, you might not think that's a big deal, but you do that day after day, week after week, and eventually you find yourself driving down the road and someone cuts you off. And instead of being reactive, you go, it's not the end of the world. I didn't get hit. I can handle it. And all of a sudden, you have more self-control. In a world where people get instant results a lot, it's a challenge, because this is definitely my approach takes self-discipline. It takes effort. It's not a quick fix, but it is a long lasting. I help people find peace, and it's possible, but it definitely takes effort for sure.
Okay, well, you mentioned earlier that you do these seminars. Now, are they available to the public, or like from a public perspective? I know we can find you on YouTube. You have this book, Walking Through Anger, this course on Himalaya. Are these seminars that you mentioned, or are they more work related, like at the prisons and places like that? Or
Right now they are, but they're going to be open to the public next year, maybe at the end of 2024. So I'd love people to stay tuned, but by 2025 for sure to the public. We have enough interest all over the world in doing them, so we're going to definitely expand that for sure. And you mentioned or earlier asked about that question about solitary confinement. It might be a good way to wind it all, to tie it all together. So I specialize in violence. I work with people who've done some of the most horrific things in the world to others. I don't even like to talk about it a lot because I hate to keep putting that content out into the world. What we fill our minds with is important. What we fill our minds with will be in our minds. A lot of times when people aren't involved in the prison system, they think, well, solitary confinement sounds like cruel and unusual punishment. But the reality is that I work with people who have tortured, raped, and killed every cellmate they ever had. And so who are you going to put with that person? Like, which person are you going to look at and say, oh, I'll have to put him with them because it's not fair to have him alone. And so when you know that, the reality is some people, I can accept people where they are, but we also have to be mindful of the real threat. So in the cartoon world, no one should be in there. In the real world, absolutely, people are going to hurt other people if they're not isolated. And that's not for everybody. And that's one of the reasons why, for people who've never worked with people in solitary confinement, it's difficult to have a strong opinion about it, because when you actually get in there, it's a totally different story. I just interacted with a guy who had a really strong opinion about stuff against officers, corrections officers, and then he went and spent a day as a correction officer, and literally within one day, not even his entire shift, his opinion changed 180. So it's a big difference when you get behind people's eyes and see things from their perspective. I would love, ideally, for prisons to be a place of learning. I strive my best to offer programs and to train officers and to work with the incarcerated population to make it a place of learning. Um, I don't think it's a super effective system the way it's set up right now. But as of right now, as solitary confinement is an absolute necessity for sure. I mean, I have instances where guys have confined, because I don't work with people who may have done it or may not have done it. By the time they work with me, not only have they done it, they may be thinking about commutation, getting out after a potential life sentence, or they just want to get rid of this off their psyche. So I'm kind of a sin eater. I'll go ahead and take it and listen to it. But
Thank you.
and it's not easy.
Well, thank you for being honest, because I have never been inside of a prison, and I've spoken with a lot of mental health professionals. Now you and well, and you are a doctor, but I've also spoken like with disability rights. All these disability rights, California is like the largest advocacy group in our country, and so a lot of these things that get passed, I mean, I'll see their perspective, but to your point, if you have not been, and I know that there's been a big push in California here to end solitary confinement, and Gavin Newsom vetoed that, and then he got a lot of criticism, but he's probably listening to people like you. Like, this is the first time I've heard that. I couldn't have imagined that people really kill their cellmates. Like, I didn't know that that happened. So if that's how, I mean, if it's a necessity,
I mean,
thank you.
to be honest, and I hate to shine a light on this, but killing is the easier thing that has happened to and does happen to so many people. I think they would choose being killed over what happens to them. So, yeah, for anyone who ever says, no, it's not right, there are people I could have you sit down with that would be a game changer for your opinion on it. So, I hate to see, I don't want to see anybody, ideally, I would never love to see anybody hurting people and then ending up in places like that. But in the real world, there are some very dangerous people who are in a very dark place and still wanting to do some damage to other people. And I would not want to be the person who says, hey, I'll put this person in there with them, because you're really punishing that person in a really extreme way.
Right. Well, I can't even thank you enough for being here. It was we just barely touched on, maybe in the future we can have another discussion, and go more into depth into yield theory if you ever have time. And I'd love to just really delve into the topic of rejection. I mean, we kind of touched on that before we started, because I think I would love to see that your kind of training starting again, like in as early as elementary school or junior high, because I certainly don't remember anything like this emotional intelligence skills to avoid some of these problems, keeping people out of prisons and jails. Like, if we could just start teaching kids at 7 and 8 years old, hey, we're going to all face rejection, whether somebody wants to be our friend, doesn't want to be our friend anymore, you might get fired. Certainly, every single person out there is going to experience a romantic rejection. Someone doesn't want to be, and I see a lot of people that marriages have ended, and it sounds like you have a very nice, from everything I listened to on
We're
you.
very blessed. 24 years we've been married.
But I mean, we all know people. I have one of my oldest high school friends, and he's been divorced now for 16 years, and he's still so stuck and angry. It hasn't manifested physically, he doesn't hit anyone, but his whole life, and he's so consumed, and he just can't. I beg him and plead for, to try to get some help and talk to someone, because it's stuck. And I see a lot of people, and it really, when I think about it, I've known him since we were like 14, went to junior high, but then I leave his presence thinking, I wish he never learned to deal with rejection, having his wife say, I want out, and move on. But she's moved on, and I'd love to see him move on, and there's a lot of life left, instead of staying in this place of anger. And I think a lot of people, if they had your tools, and I just would really love to see some of this kind of training brought into the schools as part of our curriculum, like as well as algebra and, and English and science, we have, emotional regulation or anger management, like for 20 hours of anger management and conflict resolution, because I don't think anything like this exists in the schools, and I think it would be really helpful.
I appreciate hearing that. I do believe that our daughter is a living, walking model for this approach, because this is how we raised her with the 4 C's of parenting: choices, consequences, consistency, compassion. And we're so incredibly proud of everything she is. Mostly, we're proud of her character. She has this phenomenal character and a tremendous moral compass. And it's because that's what she wants. And she's pretty amazing. So I'd like to be able to give a shout out to my wife and daughter anytime I do a podcast.
All right. Well, thank you. And if there's anything else, I'd love to have you on again. I appreciate your time today so much.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. Hope to see you next week, and please share with your friends.